doing a program on my living room floor. So this is just quite an experience. A couple disclaimers before I start. I just want to clarify a little bit that we just don't have the time to go into a lot of detail. So just consider this kind of a teaser. Consider this just a little bit of an introduction to get us started. As Graham mentioned, the recertification process as a welcoming congregation is something that the congregation is undergoing, and it's a very long, detailed, comprehensive process, which I love. I think it's a really, really great program, and I'm really excited to see UUCL get that going again. And there's not one presentation. There's not one, there's not like a couple check boxes that we can just tick off and just be good. So this is just kind of, I hope you consider this as just a beginning to the conversation. And the other disclaimer that I want to give is just that I have a lot of years of experience doing LGBT education, trans education, but I do not speak on behalf of everybody. I certainly, as a cisgender person, I do not speak on behalf of all trans people or really any one person. And so I am coming from the perspective that, so I'm cisgender. That means that my gender identity matches what I was assigned at birth. And as I grew up, that's always felt an alignment. And I really strongly believe that for those of us who are cisgender, it's our responsibility to work with one another, to work to educate ourselves on trans issues, to do the work to figure out how we can create a safe environment for trans folks in our families, in our friend groups, in our congregations, and in our communities. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on that. A little bit of context. First off, I wanted to do, with the screen sharing, was going to be doing a little definitions activity. It was actually an activity from the 7th through 9th grade OWL curriculum. And that's something that is a really cool activity that we would have done in person, or we could have done over Zoom, but that's not possible. So that would have covered some definitions. If there are questions or concerns, or you're like, wait, you just said a word, what does that mean? I'd be happy to answer those questions. And again, I won't be able to go into a lot of it just because of the lack of time. But if there are questions like that, please don't hesitate. And then for context, I just wanted to lift up that we have a really great resource available to us, really specific research about the experiences of trans, Unitarian, Universalists, and I wanted to just mention that. So the Trans Religious Professionals UUs Together, or TRUST, and the UUA Multicultural Ministries Office published a report in January of 2019. So this is really recent data that we can use to understand the experiences of trans folks in our faith communities. So they did a study of 278 trans UUs participated in this study. And what they found was that only 44% of trans UUs feel spiritually connected and nourished at their congregation. 72% of trans UUs do not feel as though their congregation is completely inclusive of them as trans people. The highest levels of that lack of full inclusion were experienced by people of color at 85%, young adults at 84%, and non-binary people at 82%. The report also found that 42% of trans UUs regularly experience trans-related marginalization in UU spaces. And so this report shows us that as a congregation, as a community, as a denomination, we have a lot of work to do. And there are a lot of things that we as a community can do. The Trust report recommends 5 key ways that UUs can increase our community's inclusion. So the first one they mention is to donate to fund trans UUs healing and survival. This organization has a fund for folks that folks can access as well as donate to. I would also expand this recommendation to look at ways that we can support trans folks financially in our communities. Secondly, they say to be an accomplice for trans UUs. They use the word accomplice instead of ally, to speak to the fact that we're in this work together, and that trans justice is connected to other forms of justice. And we have a vested interest in trans liberation and trans justice. The third recommendation is to hire trans religious professionals. There are a lot of trans religious professionals who struggle to find work in our denomination. The fourth is to engage in trans education, and knowing that that is not a one and done 90-minute workshop, it's an ongoing educational process. And to engage congregations in taking action on their next move to increase trans access, inclusion, and affirmation. Again, recognizing that this is an ongoing process. This is something that is an ever-changing issue, and we're never done learning and fighting for justice. And we're never done having the tough conversations in our communities to recognize kind of what we need to do internally. And that, I think, is going to be a great start for us, is this recertification process as a welcoming and affirming congregation. What I want to focus on, though, in this particular conversation is the internal work that we, as those of us who identify as cisgender, can and should do before we start that community work. And that's about addressing our own relationship to gender. It's about interrogating the societal norms that we've absorbed, whether we've been aware of it or not, and really deconstructing the gender binary that exists in our relationship to gender, or how we relate to gender out in the world. And this requires, of all of us, a paradigm shift. So our society considers gender to be a binary with strict boxes that we all fit into. So this gender binary is the foundation, really, of how we are taught in our society to think about gender, to understand gender. And often those of us learning about trans identities and trans people, we try to place them or their experiences onto that binary because it's all we know. It's our frame of reference. And we may do that whether we realize it or not. And that ultimately is really a privilege, right? The fact that we've never been forced to question the gender binary or really deconstruct it, because it's just how our brains are wired to understand gender. And I like to think of it as learning a new language. I had the opportunity in high school to learn French by immersion. Don't quiz me on my French, I've lost it all. I had very little experience or exposure to the language before I was immersed in it. And for the first few months, I could feel my brain struggling to, and growing and changing as it was learning this language. Whenever I would speak or write French, I would always think of the English phrase first, and then I would translate it. I would think about the sentence, I would think about the words that I would need to translate, the grammar and the sentence structure, and then I would move it into French. And I remember when I started noticing that I was just thinking in French first, when I stopped going English to French and just started speaking French. And I think that really is how it is with gender. And any paradigm shift requires us to completely break down what we know and to rewire our brain. And I think that this is a really exciting prospect. I think it's a really exciting invitation to us. I also know, though, that sometimes that doesn't always feel incredibly exciting for us. It might feel really daunting. It might feel overwhelming. So last summer, I had the really, really wonderful honor of getting to attend Midwest Leadership School, and it was such a great experience. I mean, it was wonderful. I learned so much. I'm now volunteer staff with Midwest Leadership School. I'm really sad to see that it's been canceled this summer. As wonderful of an experience as it was, I also really got to see in person my fellow UUs struggle with they/them pronouns. We had a student at the school who is non-binary and uses they/them pronouns. And I got to see in person folks really, really struggle with that. And to see some of the ways that showed up in those day-to-day experiences was really interesting. It was very frustrating. I think that if anybody at that school had been asked, hey, do you think it's important that we work as UUs to be inclusive to trans people in our community? I think everyone would have said, yes, absolutely. But when it came down to actually day-to-day conversation, integrating this into our interactions with one another, folks really struggled. This person was continually misgendered over and over again. And what I heard when people would catch themselves, or when someone would say, actually, it's they/them pronouns, and when they would be corrected, what I would hear over and over again was, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna get this. I would hear a lot of self-deprecating humor. Oh gosh, I'm so dumb is what I heard people say, or oh, I'm too old, or oh, I'll get it by the end of the week. And that dismissiveness was really disappointing. It was interesting to me. I wondered, like, where is this coming from? What is this? Why are people being so dismissive? I don't want people to be beating themselves up. I don't want them to be full of shame, but where's the middle ground there? And really, when I thought about it, what I think it comes down to, and I've seen this in UU spaces, I've seen this in other spaces, I've seen this in families, in day-to-day interactions, I think people just don't maybe give themselves enough space and time to think about what is causing a reaction for them. What feels so difficult about that? Why does it feel difficult? And I think, when we talk about this work, I think it's important to think of it as a practice. So a practice takes commitment, it takes dedication. I think it's also just an incredible act of love too. It's hard work and we're gonna mess up, but it's an act of love, it's an act of care. And that takes commitment. That is something that, I don't think it's an issue of buy-in. I think that people believe that this is something worth working towards. But when it comes to our interrogating and questioning our own relationship to gender, or if we're feeling any sort of resistance to learning about some of these new things, especially trans issues, right? So I started doing LGBT education when I was in high school, which for me I graduated high school in 2007. And the way we talk about trans issues is so radically different. And we at least were talking about trans issues. What I hear in a lot of education that I do is that for a lot of us, this was not something that we ever knew about or thought about until we were adults. And so the learning curve on this is so steep and it can feel very overwhelming. And so there's a lot to feel like we've got to get caught up on. But I've seen, when folks are engaged in this topic with curiosity, when they're engaged in this topic with intention and care, I've seen a lot of really wonderful growth happen. So what I thought I would do now is I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of what I was going to cover with the PowerPoint slides, and then we'll do a little reflective activity. So what I was going to cover with the slides is, like I mentioned, it's an activity from our OWL curriculum. It's such a great activity. I've actually incorporated it into the Safe Zone presentations that I do at Baker, because I think it's such a great overview. So basically, it's about distinguishing and defining the differences between biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. So these 4 terms are distinct categories. There's some overlap. There's always going to be some overlap. There's no strict binaries, of course, when we're talking about these kinds of things. But it is important to understand the differences. And these are relatively new differences. Sexuality and gender over the years, sometimes, historically, those were more combined identities. Maybe once the way that someone expressed their gay or lesbian sexual orientation was to dress in a certain way and to act and to present a gender in a certain way. And that's not always the case now anymore. So it is important for us to think of them as distinct categories. So the first one is biological sex. Biological sex is different than gender. And this is one that I think trips a lot of people up because we are used to thinking of those as one and the same. So biological sex refers to our secondary sex characteristics, things like chromosomes, hormones, genitalia, body and like weight distribution, the way that our bodies are formed and look and change throughout our life. Gender is an internal process. It's an internal understanding of who we are. It really is it is not necessarily at all about our actual bodies. It's about how we relate to a societal construct of gender in our heads. Sometimes when you see graphs kind of just defining these and trying to place these things on our bodies, gender is in the brain. Gender is an internal relationship. And we all get to define our gender in different ways. Now, for a cisgender person like myself, my gender, my relationship to gender for myself aligns with what was chosen for me when I was born. And so that's why growing up, I never had to deal with the fact that those felt at odds or felt different from one another. They've always felt the same. So gender, when it comes to obviously, trans issues, is not just a man and woman. That's the gender binary, right? And we might even think about gender as a spectrum, right? As there being man, woman, and then other identities in the middle. But we can also think about gender as not even on a spectrum, just as a big, expansive concept. So non-binary folks might think of it that way. Those are folks who don't feel like their gender fits in any sort of binary. There's terms like genderqueer, which might be the same thing. Someone who likes to maybe mess around with gender or play around with gender or doesn't feel like man or woman fits their definition of themselves. And then we have gender expression, which is a whole other thing. The way we feel about our gender may be different or may align with the way we express it. Really, a gender expression is about how we express and communicate our gender to the outside world. It's the way we dress, it's the way we hold our bodies, it's the way we walk, the jobs and the hobbies that we have, it's the way we style our hair, it's all kinds of different things. And it's important to think of those as 2 separate concepts because when we assume, well, if you dress this way, this means that your gender is this. That is not always true. We might if we're looking at someone, we might be able to say, oh, they're dressed in masculine clothes, or they're dressed in clothes that are traditionally associated with women. But that doesn't actually tell us what their gender is. And that takes some practice getting used to that idea if that feels like a new concept. And then sexual orientation actually has nothing to do with gender at all, in the sense that it's about who we are attracted to. It doesn't have any sort of, it doesn't play a role in defining our gender necessarily. And so sometimes people might get confused with all of these different terms. There's biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. If we were doing this in person, if we were doing this with the slideshow, we might be able to visualize this a little bit more. So again, this is just kind of a teaser, just to kind of get us introduced into some concepts. So now I would like to do a little reflective exercise, and you can engage in this however you'd like. This is something that you could close your eyes and listen to. You could watch me, although I think my video quality is not so great, so you could listen to my voice. I'm gonna read off some questions. And some of these questions might have really straightforward answers, and some of them are not. And some of them are questions that you're not sure even how you would answer. And that's okay. You don't have to have answers to them. There's no quiz at the end of this. You can just sit and absorb. And what I would encourage you to do is just notice how these questions are hitting you. How do they feel? What do they bring up? Are there memories that come up? Are there more questions that you have with some of these when I ask a question? So feel free to kind of settle yourself into your chair. Take a deep breath. You can sit in your chair a little bit. You can move your shoulders back. We'll take another deep breath in and out. So our first question is, what is your gender? And how do you know this? How do you express your gender? With your clothes? Or with your job? With your hairstyle? Or the way that you walk? What about your hobbies or your interests? How did you express your gender when you were a child? Or when you were a teenager? How did you express your gender 20 years ago, 10 years ago? How do you express your gender today? What images or role models for femininity did you have growing up? What images or role models for masculinity did you have growing up? Do you remember the first time that those definitions of femininity or masculinity were first challenged? When was the first time you remember learning about trans people? Where did most of the influence of your initial impressions or understandings of trans people come from? How have your impressions or understandings of trans people changed or evolved throughout your life? Does anything feel challenging right now or overwhelming? Where does that feeling come from? Where do you feel that in your body? Does it feel like resistance? Does it feel like discomfort? Does it feel like confusion? And does anything feel exciting right now or thrilling? Where does that feeling come from? What does that feel like? Does it feel like expansiveness? Does it feel like it's bubbling or sparking? How can you nurture that feeling? And so as we come back to the room, I will wrap up there, and I appreciate everyone's patience with all of the technological problems, and I'll open this up for questions. Any questions or thoughts that people have?